I realized something was wrong the moment he spoke. He chose every word like a man afraid of saying the wrong century. It was a cold morning in Lowell, the kind that made the river look heavier than it should, dragging a gray mist across the walkways. I wasn't expecting anything unusual. I was just taking the same route I always used before work, passing the shuttered textile mills and the streets that had been renamed so many times they barely remembered themselves. But when he stepped out from behind the old brick storefront and asked me for directions, the world around us seemed to hold its breath. At first, I thought he was just lost. Plenty of people got turned around in that part of town. Maps were outdated, signs were fading, and the recent renovations confused even locals. But he held a folded paper map like it was something fragile, almost sacred, and his hands trembled in a way that didn't match the temperature. When he pointed to a street that hadn't existed in decades, something about his voice, quiet, almost rehearsed, made my skin tighten. He sounded like someone trying hard to blend in, but not knowing what era to blend into. The more he spoke, the stranger the conversation became. He asked questions nobody asks anymore, like whether the trolley still ran or if the factories still used the old shifts. He looked at passing cars with a kind of startled fascination, then tried to hide it. I told myself he might have memory issues or maybe he was just confused, but the details didn't add up. His clothes were plain enough but not modern, not quite right either. They were like approximations of something someone had described to him. I should have walked away. I should have shrugged, said I didn't know, and kept moving. But something about him, his politeness, his fear, his loneliness, pulled me in. He looked like a man searching for the last familiar thing in a world that no longer belonged to him. And I didn't want to be the person who turned away from that. So I pointed him toward the intersection he was looking for, even though part of me felt a slow, cold unease spreading under my ribs. The street he asked for had vanished long before I was even born. I didn't know that yet, not consciously. But as he thanked me with a quiet relief that felt entirely out of place, I had the strange sensation that I had just nudged someone deeper into the wrong side of time. Before that morning in 1987, my days in Lowell followed a rhythm so predictable I could have walked them with my eyes closed. I lived alone in a modest apartment above a repair shop, where the scent of engine oil drifted up through the floorboards every afternoon. Most mornings I left just after sunrise, when the air still held the quiet of the night and the Merrimack River carried its low, steady murmur through the old mill district. It was a routine I relied on, not because it was exciting, but because it never surprised me. I wasn't the kind of person who sought out the unusual. I took comfort in the familiar. Back then, the city was in the middle of one of its many transitions. Buildings were being restored, streets were being renamed, and new signs were going up to replace the ones that had faded into illegibility. Sometimes I felt like Lowell was trying to rewrite itself faster than anyone could keep track of. Old maps no longer matched real life, and conversations with longtime residents were filled with phrases like, "It used to be here," or "That street doesn't go by that name anymore." It created a strange sense of dislocation. Not quite unsettling, but enough to make you blame yourself when things didn't look the way you remembered. I walked to work because it gave me time to think, and because I preferred the company of quiet streets to the chatter of buses. I wasn't unhappy, not exactly, but I carried a kind of low-weight loneliness I rarely acknowledged. The sort that sits on your shoulders yet leaves no visible mark. Maybe that's why I noticed him. Maybe I recognized something familiar in the way he looked around, as if hoping a landmark would prove he hadn't wandered too far from where he was supposed to be. The mills, the narrow alleys, the river path, they were the closest things I had to stability. Every morning I traced the same line across the city, like a thread stitching the hours together. I never imagined someone could step into that routine and bend it in ways I wouldn't understand until much later. But that's what happened. One ordinary morning on the same route I took every day, someone I had never seen before stepped out from between two buildings and changed the shape of my life so gently that I didn't notice the shift until it was already too late. And if I had known who he really was, or rather when he was from, I might have answered his question differently. Hi, my name is Michael. If you're enjoying this story so far, I'd really appreciate it if you subscribe to the channel. It helps me keep bringing these moments to life. Have you ever met someone who felt strangely out of place, like they didn't quite belong in the time you were in? Thank you to everyone who's been supporting the channel. Now let's get back to the story. I remember the exact moment he stepped into my path because everything around us seemed to slow down. Not dramatically, not like in movies, but in that quiet, almost imperceptible way that makes you think the world is listening. I had just crossed the narrow footbridge near the Textile Museum, the one where the boards creak under your weight even if you walk lightly. The morning haze clung to the river, blurring its edges, and the cold hung in the air like a thin film. I pulled my jacket tighter, lowered my head against the breeze, and kept walking. And then he appeared. He emerged from the space between two old brick buildings, their windows long boarded up, their faded signs barely readable. At first glance, he didn't look threatening. If anything, he looked hesitant, as though unsure whether he should approach me at all. But it wasn't just hesitation. It was something deeper, something like disorientation. He paused a few steps away, eyes scanning my face with a kind of careful study, the way you look at someone when you're trying to determine whether they're from here or from somewhere else entirely. "Excuse me," he said, and the way his voice caught made my breath stall. There it was again, that unnerving precision. Every syllable placed deliberately, cautiously, like he was choosing from a list of acceptable possibilities, like he was afraid of saying the wrong thing, or the wrong era. It echoed the same feeling I'd had in The Hook. He chose every word like a man afraid of saying the wrong century. He unfolded a street map, one of those thick paper ones you'd find in gas stations 2-3 decades ago, the kind printed before everything became glossy and disposable. The creases were worn soft, almost white from years of folding and unfolding. He held it with both hands, gripping the edges tightly, as though the wind might tear it away and take something vital with it. "Can you tell me how to get here?" he asked, pointing to a street name I didn't immediately recognize. Hawthorne Slip. The ink was slightly smudged, and the font looked old-fashioned, the kind used before modern typesetting became widespread. At first, I assumed it was somewhere on the outskirts or a back alley I'd never had a reason to visit. Lowell had plenty of hidden corners like that, but something about the name tugged at me, not in a way I could place, more like a memory I didn't have. I looked up from the map and noticed something else about him. His clothes weren't wrong exactly, but they weren't right either. His jacket was a muted gray, stiff at the seams, the kind of cut I'd only seen in thrift stores that specialized in older stock. His shoes were polished but worn, too formal for a morning walk, and his eyes scanned the street as if expecting it to look different, as if the buildings should have been taller, or smaller, or newer, or older. "It should be close," I told him, though something in me whispered that wasn't true. "Let me think for a second." He watched me with an intensity that felt almost fragile, like he was depending on me in a way I didn't understand yet. And that was the moment, I think, when I realized this wasn't just a stranger who'd lost his way. It was someone who was lost in a different sense entirely. I took a step closer to look at the map more carefully, trying to anchor myself in something familiar. But the paper was so faded, so aged, that it felt like touching a memory rather than an object. Streets I knew were there, but not as they looked now. Their names were outdated, their shapes slightly wrong, as though someone had redrawn the city from an older version of itself. I tilted my head, tracing the lines with my finger, and the longer I stared, the more a sense of unease began to settle into my chest. "Hawthorne Slip," I murmured, testing the name on my tongue. It didn't belong to the Lowell I knew, not in 1987, not in any of the maps I'd grown up with. Slip was a term used for narrow access lanes tied to canals or mills, common in the early industrial era. But almost all of those had been absorbed into newer developments or renamed decades ago. The word felt out of time, and the more I studied it, the more that small whisper inside me insisted something was off. He watched me with a quiet urgency, his posture stiff, his breath shallow. I could feel the pressure of his expectation, like he was waiting for me to unlock something. And when he spoke again, his voice carried a strange tremor. They told me it would still be here." I looked up. "Who told you that?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, his gaze drifted past me toward the river, the mills, the brickwork softened by weather and years. His expression shifted, not confusion this time, but something deeper, almost like grief. Then he blinked, steadied himself, and shook his head. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "I didn't mean to trouble you." I felt that same pull in my chest, the quiet loneliness I carried, mirrored in someone else just enough to make me stay. I'd always been the kind of person who lingered a little too long in conversations. who offered help even when it wasn't needed. Maybe it was because I knew what it was like to feel misplaced in your own life, or maybe it was just the stillness of his voice, the hint of a story behind it. "No trouble," I said. "Let me think." I folded the map back the way he had it, noting again how the paper felt older than anything a traveler should be carrying in '87. Something about it reminded me of the maps my grandfather had kept in his desk, kept even after the roads changed, after the mills closed, after the city grew beyond what the lines once described. Maps belonging to a time that no longer existed. "Could the name have changed?" I asked. His eyes widened just a fraction, like the idea hadn't even occurred to him. "Changed?" he echoed, barely above a whisper. "Yeah, it happens a lot here. Streets get renamed. Sometimes whole sections disappear from new maps." He swallowed hard, as though the thought unsettled him more than it should have. "I see," he murmured, but his reaction wasn't the normal disappointment of a confused visitor. It was something closer to fear, the fear of someone who needed the place to exist exactly as he remembered it. And that was when I felt it, the first subtle shift inside me, the quiet certainty that this wasn't a man simply lost in the city. He was lost in something much larger. I glanced down the street, trying to piece together what Hawthorne Slip could have become. Lowell had a habit of burying its past beneath new signs and new intentions, but the bones of the old city still showed if you knew where to look. Narrow alleys that once housed factory workers, dead ends that used to be canals, slight curves in the road hinting at erased pathways. The city never truly forgot itself, it only hid the pieces. Yet nothing about his map matched the Lowell I knew, not even in fragments. "There used to be a Hawthorne Street," I said slowly, searching my memory. "But not a slip, and not around here." He leaned forward just slightly, as if the words were a lifeline. "When did it change?" he asked. I shook my head. "Not sure. Before I was born, maybe. My dad talked about old mills getting torn down in the 50s and 60s. A lot of small roads disappeared." His face tightened, not with frustration, but with a kind of restrained panic, the kind you see in someone who realizes the ground under their feet doesn't match the map in their hands. He folded the paper quickly, almost protectively, and tucked it into his coat as though afraid someone might take it. Or worse, prove the error he didn't want to admit. "I need to find it," he said. "It's important." "Why?" The question slipped out before I could stop it. He hesitated. His lips parted, closed, opened again. For a moment, he looked younger, lost, vulnerable, like someone trying to form a sentence in a language he barely remembered. "It's where I'm supposed to be," he said quietly. "Where something should still be waiting for me." The words carried a tremor that brushed cold against my spine. People said things like that when they talked about childhood homes, old friends, places tied to memory. But his tone wasn't nostalgic. It was absolute, like he was following instructions, like he was trying to return to a fixed point. "You said someone told you it would still be here," I said. "Who?" He exhaled slowly, his breath forming a faint cloud in the cold morning air. "I'm not sure you'd believe me." I almost laughed, not out of humor, but out of the strange, deep instinct that I would believe him. I didn't know why, but I already sensed that whatever truth he carried wasn't one that fit neatly into ordinary explanations. "Try me," I said. He looked around again at the quiet buildings, the river, the empty sidewalks, at all the markers of a world he didn't seem to fully recognize. Then he lowered his voice to a near whisper. "Someone who'd been here before. Someone who told me this place mattered." Before I could ask more, he took a half step back, as if bracing himself for a decision. "Can you show me?" he said. "Even if it's gone, maybe I'll know what I'm looking for when I see it." There was something in his eyes, an ache I understood too well, even if I didn't understand its cause. So I nodded. And that was how I ended up walking beside a man who didn't belong in my timeline, toward a street that hadn't existed in decades. We walked in silence at first, not the uncomfortable kind, but the kind that forms when two people are trying to make sense of where they are, one geographically, the other emotionally. The air was cold enough to sting my fingers, and the river's damp breath drifted through the streets in slow curls. Lowell wasn't loud that early in the morning, but the distant hum of traffic and the hollow echoes from the mill buildings usually grounded me. On that walk, though, everything felt slightly displaced, like someone had nudged the world half an inch to the left. He walked beside me with a deliberate steadiness, eyes scanning everything we passed. Not with curiosity, but with a kind of cautious urgency, as if comparing what he saw to something he carried in memory. Every few steps he slowed, watching the shape of a building, or the angle of a street, or a row of windows that seemed to spark some half-recognition. But each time I could see the moment disappointment settled over him. Quiet, heavy, familiar. "What was here?" he asked once, pointing at an empty lot fenced off by rusted wire. I tried to remember. Used to be a small warehouse, torn down a few years back. Before that, I'm not sure. He nodded slowly, absorbing the information like someone collecting scraps of a story. And before that, I shrugged. Nothing I can remember. Maybe something from the textile days. The way he looked at me after I said that, the way his brow tightened, just slightly, made me feel like I'd given him the wrong answer to a question he hadn't asked. We crossed a narrow intersection, the kind bordered by brick sidewalks and old lampposts that hadn't been replaced yet. He stopped suddenly, turning his head as though sensing something invisible. His eyes traced the space between the lamppost and a boarded-up storefront, and for a moment his shoulders eased, almost as if he'd found a familiar landmark. "This," he murmured. "Something here used to be different." I followed his gaze. There was nothing remarkable there, just the remains of old signage and a crooked step where the sidewalk had cracked. But he stared at it with the intensity of someone recognizing a friend in a crowd. "When were you last here?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. He didn't answer right away. His fingers reached out, hovering inches from the brick wall, not touching it, but studying its texture as though comparing it to a memory. "A long time ago," he said finally. "Longer than you'd think." The word sat between us like a quiet confession, and for the first time, I began to understand that whatever he was searching for wasn't simply a location. It was a moment, a point in the timeline he expected to step into, and instead found only its shadow. We kept walking. The streets grew narrower, and the buildings leaned closer together. He seemed more alert now, as if each corner might reveal something crucial. And then, just as we turned onto a side street lined with old tenements, he spoke again, soft, uncertain. "If the name changed," he said, "does that mean the place changed too?" "That depends," I answered. "Sometimes it's just the name. Sometimes it's everything." He closed his eyes briefly, as though the distinction pained him. "I need it to be the same," he whispered, "just this once." And the way he said it, so quietly, so desperately, made the back of my neck prickle, because I realized he wasn't afraid of being lost. He was afraid of being too late. We moved deeper into the older part of the district, where the brickwork grew darker and the streets narrowed into crooked angles that didn't appear on modern maps. The city felt different there, quieter, heavier, as if it carried the echo of a time that hadn't fully settled. He walked a half step ahead of me now, his eyes darting from doorway to doorway, glancing up at faded windows like he expected to see a familiar face looking back. "Was this always here?" he asked suddenly, stopping in front of a barber shop with a sun-bleached pole and a wooden sign that looked older than both of us. "Yeah," I said. "My grandfather used to come here. They remodeled a bit, but it's been around forever." He stared at the entrance for a long time, studying the doorframe, the chipped paint, the way the sidewalk sloped downward at the corner. Then he shook his head and stepped back. "No," he said softly. "It shouldn't be like this." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "The door," he murmured. "It used to open to the left, and the sign, it wasn't wood." He said it with a strange certainty, as if he'd walked through that very doorway countless times. But everything he described belonged to a version of the building that hadn't existed in decades, if ever. "What year are you thinking of?" I asked. He swallowed, hesitating. "I'm not sure I can answer that." There was no sarcasm in his voice, no attempt at being cryptic. He said it the way you admit a wound you don't know how to explain. We continued walking, passing alleyways that breathed out cold drafts and narrow passages that seemed to lean inward, as if the buildings were whispering. Lowell had always had this effect in winter. The air pressed closer, sounds traveled farther, and time felt thick, like syrup. But with him beside me, that sensation sharpened into something almost tactile. It felt like we were walking along a seam in the world, and if either of us pressed too hard, it might tear. "Here," he said abruptly. He stopped at a quiet intersection where a single street lamp flickered against the morning light. The pavement slanted downward toward a cul-de-sac lined with boarded windows. Nothing special, nothing memorable, just another leftover corner of an old industrial city. But the way he looked at it, his breath catching, his shoulders squaring, made it clear that to him, this place mattered. "It should be this way," he said. Hawthorne Slip. It ran parallel to a warehouse. There was a narrow path, cobblestones. His voice faltered, and a gate at the end. "There's no gate here," I said gently. He nodded, but his eyes didn't leave the dead-end street. They shimmered, not with tears exactly, but with the dawning realization that something irreversible had happened. "Maybe it was torn down," I offered. "Cities change, Lowell especially." He let out a breath that trembled. "That's the problem," he whispered. "Where I come from, it wasn't supposed to change yet." The words hit me like a cold draft sweeping between buildings. Not where I used to live, not how I remember it, but where I come from, spoken with the quiet certainty of someone admitting they were from another version of this place, another timeline entirely. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The street was quiet except for the faint rattle of a loose window shutter and the crunch of grit under passing tires from the main road. He stood perfectly still, hands buried in his coat pockets, shoulders tense as though bracing against something only he could feel. I watched him carefully. There was no madness in his expression, no wildness, no confusion, just the heavy sadness of someone realizing the world around him had shifted without permission. "I shouldn't have expected it to be the same," he said finally, still staring at the cul-de-sac. "But I hoped." "Hoped for what?" I asked softly. He took a long breath, a way back. I felt the air change between us, just slightly, like a temperature drop. Part of me wanted to laugh it off, dismiss it as poetic language or the rambling of a man lost in memories. But the way he spoke, there was no metaphor. He meant it literally. "You think you're from—" My voice trailed. I didn't know how to finish the sentence. "Another time? Another version of this place? Another life?" He saved me the trouble. "A different when," he said. His eyes shifted toward me, and for the first time, he didn't try to hide the truth. His fear wasn't of the city. It was of revealing himself. "Look," I said, choosing my words carefully. "People get disoriented. Maps change, streets are renamed. Memory plays tricks. Maybe—" He shook his head before I could finish. "It's not memory. I have the coordinates. I have the reference point. I followed everything exactly." "Coordinates?" I repeated. "What are you talking about?" He reached into his coat and pulled out a small notebook, thin, leather-bound, worn at the edges. The pages inside weren't like anything I'd seen in an everyday journal. Some were filled with neat columns of numbers. Others had diagrams, angles, measurements, intersecting lines. And one page showed a crude sketch of a street layout that didn't match anything in present-day Lowell. "This is how I got here," he said quietly, "or how I was supposed to get back." I stared at the notations, trying to make sense of them. They weren't maps in the usual sense, and they weren't random scribbles either. They looked intentional, systematic, almost like instructions. "But these coordinates," he added, tapping the page with a trembling finger, "they only work if the reference points still exist. A city isn't just space, it's time stacked on top of itself. If a building disappears, or a street collapses, or a landmark is moved." He closed the notebook. The doorway closes. A cold weight settled in my stomach. "So Hawthorne Slip was a reference point," I said slowly. He nodded once. "And it's gone." The silence that followed felt thick, like fog pressing against my chest. I realized then what he'd been searching for wasn't just a street, it was a piece of the path home. And that piece had vanished decades before he ever arrived. He looked at me with an expression I still have trouble describing, something between gratitude and grief. "I don't think I can get back," he said. And in that moment, standing in the quiet remains of a city that no longer matched his memories, I understood. The stranger wasn't lost. He was stranded. For a long moment, I didn't know what to say. The weight of his words settled over us like the morning fog thickening against the brick walls. He closed the notebook gently, as though afraid it might crumble if handled too roughly, and slipped it back inside his coat. The gesture was tender, almost reverent, like someone protecting the last page of a life they could no longer return to. Stranded, I repeated, not sure I believed the word even as I spoke it. It happens, he said quietly. Not often. Not unless you miscalculate, or the world has changed more than your notes predict. But it happens. He wasn't joking. He wasn't delusional. His voice carried a calm acceptance, the kind that comes only after you've repeated something to yourself 100 times. And God help me, something in me believed him. Or at least, believed that he believed it, deeply, painfully, without question. We started walking again, not toward any destination this time, but simply to keep moving. I think both of us sensed that standing still would make the truth sink even deeper. "What was Hawthorne Slip to you?" I asked after a few minutes. He hesitated, hands tightening inside his pockets. "A fixed point." He paused. "And something else." I waited, giving him space. "It was where I left," he said. The words carried a softness that startled me. Not nostalgic, but fragile, like a story that breaks a little more each time you tell it. "You mean physically left?" I asked. "Yes. The coordinates align with structures, patterns, the river path, the angle of the mills, the elevation drop." He shook his head. "They're not here anymore. Not in the way they must be." I tried to imagine what it must feel like, to return expecting familiarity and instead finding a world reshaped beyond recognition. Not by miles, not by borders, but by years. "What were you trying to go back to?" I asked. He exhaled, a slow breath that hinted at something deeper, something painful. "A promise," he said. "Nothing more." But the word alone held enough weight to quiet the street around us. We walked past a row of brick tenements with iron fire escapes zigzagging down the walls. A delivery truck rumbled by, its engine roaring before fading into a distant hum. He watched it with an expression I couldn't quite read, part curiosity, part sorrow. "Everything feels wrong," he murmured. "Not completely. Just enough to tell me this isn't my place anymore." "Does anyone know you're here?" I asked. He shook his head. "It doesn't work that way." There was something crushing in the simplicity of that sentence. It made me wonder what kind of life he'd left behind, what kind of people might be waiting for someone who would never return. We reached an old stone bench facing the river. He sat carefully, wiping dust from the edge like it mattered. I sat beside him, the chill of the seat seeping through my coat. "You're the first person I've told," he said quietly. "Why me?" I asked. He looked at the river, eyes distant. "Because you stopped," he said. "Most people walk past the lost." His voice wasn't accusing, it was grateful. And for the first time I realized he wasn't asking for directions. He was asking for help. We sat on that cold stone bench for a while, the river moving slowly in front of us, carrying bits of debris that glinted faintly in the pale light. It was the kind of morning that asked nothing of you, no decisions, no direction, yet somehow seemed to reveal everything you'd been trying not to face. I could feel his exhaustion settling around him like a second coat. Not physical exhaustion, but the fatigue of someone who had run out of answers. "What happens now?" I asked gently. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he watched the water with a kind of reverence, as though it held a timeline only he could read. The current tugged at floating leaves, pulling them past a stone pillar darkened by age. The quiet hum of the city drifted behind us, far enough to feel distant, close enough to remind us that time, in this world, moved with no regard for who had fallen out of step with it. "You said Hawthorne Slip was where you left from," I continued. "Left to where?" He pressed his lips together, debating how much to reveal. "Forward," he said finally. "And backward. It depends on alignment." "Alignment of what?" "Events," he replied. "Structures, choices. There are seams in the timeline, places where the years sit thinner, where the past and present almost touch. You can pass through if you know how, if everything lines up the way it should." His voice carried neither pride nor superiority. It was almost clinical, like he was describing a delicate process that required absolute precision. "And you aligned wrong?" I asked softly. He winced. "No, I aligned correctly." A pause. The world didn't. I didn't understand. Not fully, but I could feel the truth of it. The sense that he had followed instructions written for a world that no longer existed. "It's like trying to return to a house," he said. and finding the entire neighborhood rebuilt. Same ground, same sky, but nothing you remember is where it should be. There was a heaviness in his tone, something like mourning. Why were you trying to go back? I asked. He hesitated, and this time it wasn't calculation. It was pain. There was someone I promised to return to, he said. Someone who waited for me once already. Someone who didn't deserve to be left again. A knot formed in my throat. The way he said it carried a tenderness that didn't belong to someone confused or unstable. It belonged to someone who had loved deeply enough to risk whatever he had risked. And now? I asked. He shook his head. I don't know if she exists here, or if she ever did. This version of the city might never have led to her. His shoulders bowed slightly as if the weight of two timelines rested on them. I trusted the coordinates, he whispered, but the references are gone. Every one of them. And that means the path home is closed. The river's surface rippled as a breeze brushed across it. I watched him stare at the water as though hoping it might carry a different answer toward him. A thought settled quietly inside me then, something I hadn't considered before, something that changed the way I looked at him. He wasn't just stranded. He was grieving a life that only existed somewhere else. We stayed by the river until the cold began to seep through our clothes, but neither of us seemed eager to leave. There was something strangely grounding about that quiet stretch of water, as if it existed outside the rush of hours the rest of the world obeyed. He leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, hands clasped together tightly, as if afraid that letting go of that posture would make everything he told me unravel. "Do you regret trying?" I asked after a long silence. He let out a breath that condensed into a thin cloud and drifted upward. "No," he said. "If I hadn't tried, I would have spent the rest of my life wondering if I'd abandoned her." This was the only way to know. The word abandoned hung heavily in the air. It wasn't about blame, it was about longing, about promises that spanned more than one lifetime. He didn't speak about her like someone who had been left behind in the traditional sense. It was deeper than that, an echo pulled across years that didn't align anymore. "Do you think she's looking for you?" I asked. He smiled at that, small, sad, sincere. "Maybe," he said, "but she's looking in a world where I haven't disappeared. That's what hurts the most. She's waiting for a version of me who isn't lost." The simplicity of that idea unsettled me. The notion that somewhere, somewhen, there was a life continuing without him. A life where he returned as planned, stepping through the right doorway at the right moment. But the man sitting beside me wasn't the one who made it there. He was the one who slipped between cracks in time and ended up on the wrong side of the seam. "Why tell me all this?" I asked quietly. He turned his head toward me, studying my face the way he had the first time, carefully, as if trying to see whether I could hold the weight of his story. "Because you don't look away," he said. "Most people sense something strange and shut down. They pretend they didn't notice. You stayed." I didn't know what to say. Maybe there was truth in his words. Maybe loneliness recognizes loneliness, no matter the year. Maybe something in the quiet way he spoke reminded me of the things I avoided confronting in my own life. He straightened slowly, rubbing his hands together for warmth. "I need to understand this timeline," he said. "If I can find a stable point, anything that matches what I remember, maybe there's still a chance." "Even without Hawthorne's slip?" I asked. He hesitated, then nodded. "Even without it. A slip can be renamed, a doorway can be rebuilt. But if I find just one unchanged point, it might lead me to the next." His optimism wasn't bright. It was worn, frayed, the way hope becomes when stretched thin for too many years. But it was still hope. "So we keep looking?" I asked. He blinked, surprised. "You'd help me?" I shrugged lightly, though the truth ran deeper. "You're not the only one who feels misplaced sometimes." For the first time since I'd met him, something like gratitude, real gratitude, softened his features. "Then yes," he said, "we keep looking." And with that small agreement, unspoken but binding, we stood and began walking again. Two people moving through a world that belonged fully to neither of us. We headed toward the part of Lowell where the old canals twisted beneath brick arches and iron walkways. The morning had brightened slightly, but the light was thin, filtered through winter clouds, giving everything a washed-out quality, as if the city itself were fading into an older photograph. He walked beside me with renewed purpose, though it wasn't confidence exactly. It was the determination of someone holding on to the last thread of possibility. You said you're looking for a stable point, I said. How do you recognize one? He considered this, slowing his steps. It's not something you see, he said. It's something you feel. A place where the timeline sits heavy, where things line up the way they were meant to. That sounds abstract, I admitted. He smiled faintly. Because it is. Time isn't a straight line, not really. Think of it like layers of paint, years on top of years. Usually they blend, sometimes they don't. When they don't, those spots become seams, weak points, doorways, and stable points, I pressed. They're places where nothing ever fully erases what came before. He gestured ahead. Old canals, foundations, stone bridges. The older the structure, the more likely it is to hold its shape across timelines. So we're looking for something old enough to remember itself. He nodded. Exactly. We crossed a narrow bridge whose wooden planks creaked beneath our feet. I'd walked that same bridge hundreds of times without thinking much of it. But now, walking beside him, I felt an odd pull. The air seemed denser, the sound of water echoing differently under the beams. Maybe it was my imagination, or maybe he'd made me aware of something I'd never noticed. He paused halfway across, leaning lightly against the railing. His eyes scanned the canal, tracing the curve of the water, the moss along the stone walls, the pattern of frost clinging to the metal bolts. This place, he whispered. You feel something? I asked. He closed his eyes for a moment. Yes, it's familiar. Not exactly as I remember it, but close. I let him stand there in silence, giving him space to process whatever tugged at him from the edges of time. He inhaled deeply, and when he opened his eyes, there was a flicker of warmth in them. This bridge existed in my world too, he said. Different name, different repairs, but the structure, it's the same. So this is a stable point? Maybe. He placed a hand on the railing. If I'm right, there should be another one nearby. They tend to align, like anchors. We followed the canal as it curved under a brick overpass. A train horn echoed faintly from somewhere beyond the mills, vibrating through the cold air. He stopped again at an intersection where a cobblestone path split off from the main sidewalk. This feels wrong, he murmured. Wrong how? He stepped onto the cobblestones, testing each one with a slow, almost reverent pace. These stones, they're too new. His voice tightened. In my world, they weren't replaced yet. I watched him sink slightly, shoulders lowering. It wasn't disappointment. It was the slow unraveling of hope. But the bridge still exists, I said. That's something. Yes, he whispered. But one anchor is not enough. He stepped back onto the sidewalk, exhaling sharply. If I don't find at least two more, the path remains broken. And in the dim light of that cold morning, I realized we were no longer searching the streets. We were searching the seams that held a different world together. We turned away from the canal and continued following the narrow side streets, our footsteps echoing softly off the old brick facades. The city was waking up now, shops unlocking, distant voices rising, car engines warming in driveways. But none of it felt intrusive. It all seemed far away, like background noise in a dream. He moved through the streets with the tentative certainty of someone who half recognized a place. The way you might navigate a childhood neighborhood seen only in fading photographs. We should look for structures that predate the mills, he said. Something older, something the years couldn't rewrite. Like what? I asked. A retaining wall, a foundation, a boundary line that stayed fixed even when everything else shifted. I thought for a moment. There's an old stone perimeter near the historic district, I said. Part of an old property line. The city never removed it. His eyes brightened. Not with excitement exactly, but with a spark of possibility that seemed too fragile to disturb. Show me, he said. We made our way toward a quiet residential block where Victorian houses stood shoulder to shoulder, their porches creaking under the slightest wind. As we walked, he slowed every now and then, tilting his head as though listening to something beneath the surface of the world. Something subtle, inaudible to anyone but him. Each time he paused, his expression shifted between hope and disappointment. There, I said, pointing ahead. At the end of the street stood a low stone wall, old, uneven, patched in places with cement that had weathered into the same gray as the original stones. It wrapped around the corner of a property like a boundary marker left behind by another century. Moss grew thick between the cracks. A few dead leaves clung stubbornly to its base. He approached it slowly, as though afraid the slightest movement might disturb whatever truth he hoped to find. Then he placed one hand gently on the stone. The effect was immediate. His breath hitched. His eyes widened, not with shock, but with recognition so deep it made my skin prickle. "This is one of them," he whispered, exactly as it was. I stepped closer. "You're sure?" He nodded slowly. The alignment, the height, the offset in the corner. His fingers traced the contour of a chipped edge. "This hasn't changed." I felt something shift inside him, a delicate rekindling of hope, faint but real. "If this anchor held," he continued, "then the next one should be within a certain radius." "Where?" He drew an invisible line in the air, measuring angles only he understood. Then he turned toward a narrow street branching off to the right. "Somewhere that way," he said. We started down the path, but after only a few steps he stopped abruptly. Not because he'd found something, but because something was missing. "There should be a second wall," he said, scanning the houses. "Parallel to the first one. It formed a corridor." I looked around. "There's nothing like that here now." His shoulders tightened. "Then it's been demolished." A silence settled between us, not just disappointment, but the quiet collapse of alignment. "One lost anchor," he said. "I can work around. Two, maybe. But with each one gone, the path distorts." "And if too many are missing?" I asked. His gaze dropped to the ground. "Then the way home collapses entirely." The words felt heavier than anything he'd said before. Not dramatic, simply true. We continued walking, but something in him had dimmed. The fragile hope the stone wall had sparked was already thinning again. And for the first time that morning, I felt a quiet dread, because he wasn't just searching for a place. He was searching for proof that the world hadn't abandoned him. We followed the direction he indicated, though neither of us spoke for several minutes. The street narrowed into a long slope bordered by weathered houses whose paint had peeled in strips, revealing older layers beneath. It looked like time itself had shed its skin here, one decade at a time, leaving the past exposed in thin patches. Still, nothing resembled what he was expecting. I watched his pace slow with each block, watched his eyes shift more restlessly from building to building, as if hoping for even one detail that matched the world he left behind. "It should be right here," he murmured finally. We stopped in front of an empty lot filled with cracked pavement and tufts of dry grass. A chain-link fence surrounded it, sagging in places where rust had eaten through the metal. A weathered sign warned against trespassing, its corners curled from years of sun. "What was here?" I asked gently. "An old boarding house," he said. 3 floors, built long before the mills expanded. The front door leaned slightly inward, and the right window was boarded up even in my time. "It shouldn't be gone." His voice broke subtly, not in sound, but in rhythm, the way a story falters when the memory behind it becomes too painful to hold. He stepped closer to the fence, gripping it lightly with one hand. The wire rattled under his fingers. "I used to pass it on my way," he continued, almost to himself. "It was one of my markers, a guidepost. And now?" He didn't finish. He didn't need to. The empty space said enough. "Cities change," I said softly. "Sometimes faster than we expect." He let out a quiet, uneven breath. "Not like this," he whispered. "Not this much. Not this many missing threads." The wind picked up, rustling the dry grass inside the lot. A loose sheet of tin clattered against a corner. The sound echoed strangely, not loud, not sharp, but hollow, like something was missing from the space that sound should have bounced off of. He stepped back from the fence, running a hand over his face. "I was prepared for small differences," he said. "A new coat of paint, a changed shop name, a building renovated. But this," he gestured around helplessly, "this timeline has unraveled differently than mine. Too differently. Every change echoes into the next." His hand trembled slightly as he lowered it. "It means I wasn't just displaced." He met my eyes, and I felt a quiet dread settle in my stomach. "I was diverted," he said. "Diverted?" I repeated. "Yes." His voice grew steadier, almost resigned. "Sent into a version of the world where the coordinates no longer align. A branch where the path home was never meant to exist." He turned his gaze back to the empty lot, jaw tightening. "Hawthorne Slip wasn't just renamed," he said. "It was erased. This house wasn't just torn down. It never needed to stand long enough for my reference point to hold. The second wall didn't survive, and the third might not have been built at all. He exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the cold air. "This isn't just a different year," he whispered. "It's a different history." The weight of that realization seemed to pull his shoulders inward, as though the world had shifted a few degrees farther from him. And standing beside him, I had the painful sense that the distance between where he belonged and where he stood was growing wider with every breath. We left the empty lot behind, but the silence between us carried its outline like a ghost, an absence that followed with every step. He walked more slowly now, not because he was tired, but because the weight of what he'd realized seemed to anchor his feet to the ground. His gaze wandered from storefronts to lampposts to rooftops, searching for anything familiar, but there was a hollow quality to his movements, as if he was already halfway withdrawn from the world around him. "We can still look," I said after a while. "Maybe there's another place that didn't change." He shook his head gently. "You don't understand. It isn't about finding one place, or two. It's about the pattern." He tapped his temple lightly. "Every timeline has its rhythm, a cadence. If too many beats change, the entire structure shifts." "Meaning what?" I asked. "Meaning the doorway home doesn't just close." He paused. "It never existed here to begin with." The words landed with a quiet finality that made my chest tighten. I wanted to argue, to tell him he didn't know that for certain, that he couldn't give up. But the look in his eyes stopped me, because it wasn't despair I saw there. It was recognition. Acceptance. The kind that only comes when a truth is undeniable. We reached a small park tucked between two long rows of colonial houses. I'd walked past it 100 times without paying much attention, but now, even in winter's dim palette, it felt strangely calm. A cluster of benches circled a bare tree whose branches stretched upward in stark, twisting lines, like frozen rivers of wood. "Let's sit," he said softly. We took a seat on a metal bench that creaked under our weight. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, clasping his hands together. His breaths came slower now, deeper, as though bracing against the cold truth settling inside him. "When I left," he said, "I followed instructions perfectly. They were precise, tested, calculated." A faint tremor touched his voice. "But instructions only work in the timeline they were written for." I swallowed. "So you think you slipped into the wrong one?" He nodded once. "A branch. A variation. Slight at first, just enough differences to pull me off the intended path." His eyes drifted across the park. "Places vanish here sooner. Structures change earlier. Maybe people make different choices. Maybe cities rebuild differently." He rubbed his thumb against his palm, a nervous habit I hadn't noticed until now. "I kept hoping," he continued, "that I'd find just enough familiar ground to anchor a return route. But every reference point is gone. Some never existed, and that means my path." He didn't finish. He didn't have to. My breath caught in my throat as I realized the full meaning of his silence. "You're stuck," I whispered. He closed his eyes, not in defeat, but in something far heavier, far more honest. "Yes," he said, "I think I am." The wind brushed past, stirring the dry leaves at our feet. Somewhere in the distance, a bell chimed the hour, its tone soft, almost mournful, as if marking not just the passing of time, but the loss of a timeline entirely. For a while, we sat without speaking. The quiet of the park settled around us like a thin blanket, cold but strangely protective. A lone bird hopped across the frozen ground near our feet, pecking at something buried beneath the frost. Its small, repetitive movements drew my attention, grounding me just enough to keep the weight of his words from crushing my chest entirely. "What will you do now?" I finally asked. He let out a long, steady breath and leaned back against the bench. His shoulders rose and fell slowly, as though each breath carried the burden of two different lives, the one he lived and the one he had lost. "I don't know," he admitted. "There's no guide for this, no instruction for ending up in the wrong version of home." I turned slightly toward him. "You said someone was waiting for you." "Yes." His voice softened to a near whisper. "In my world, I was supposed to return. I left knowing she'd be there. I left trusting the path." "And here?" I asked. He shook his head slowly. "Here, she might not exist at all. Or if she does, she isn't the same. Different childhood, different choices, different life." He paused. "A different timeline makes different people. There was a quiet devastation in his words, not loud, not dramatic, but deep. The kind of grief that comes not from loss, but from the realization that what you longed for is unreachable in every way. "You can still build a life here," I said, though the words felt thin, inadequate. He gave me a small, grateful smile. "Perhaps. But I'm a stranger to this world. Everything is familiar enough to hurt, yet different enough to confuse." I understood then that his grief wasn't just for the life he left. It was for the version of himself who belonged there. "Is there truly no chance?" I asked. "No way to reconstruct the path?" "If the alignment is wrong," he said gently, "even perfect steps take you to the wrong door." He glanced toward the street. "And this world's hawthorn slip never matched mine. It diverged too early. The entire structure branched before my instructions were ever written." He rubbed his hands together, warming them against the cold metal bench. "The truth is, I arrived somewhere I was never meant to, and now I have to learn how to exist here." The simplicity of that admission cut deeper than any other part of his story, not because of the impossibility of it all, but because of the acceptance in his voice. A quiet surrender, not to fate, but to reality. We watched a few people pass by at a distance, neighbors walking dogs, a man carrying groceries, a child hopping between patches of ice on the sidewalk. Each person moved with the effortless belonging of someone anchored to their own time. "They don't know," he murmured. "No one here knows that their world is only one version of many, one thread, and you're tangled in the wrong one," I said softly. He nodded. "But you found me," he added after a moment. "Someone who listened, someone who didn't turn away. Maybe that's something. Maybe that's a place to start." His eyes shifted toward me, and for the first time since we met, I saw something new in them. Not hope exactly, but the first faint outline of acceptance. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for walking with me, even when you didn't understand where I was coming from, or where I was trying to go." I nodded, unable to find the right words. Because the truth was simple. Neither of us knew what came next. We stayed in the park until the cold crept too deeply into our coats to ignore. When we finally stood, he didn't move with the same urgency as before. The frantic searching, the constant scanning of rooftops and alleyways, it had quieted. Not because he no longer cared, but because he understood the truth. The world he arrived in was not his, and no amount of searching would stitch it into the one he hoped to return to. As we stepped back onto the sidewalk, he paused and looked around slowly, as though memorizing the layout of this version of Lowell, the version that had trapped him. The morning light had shifted slightly, brightening the tops of the houses while leaving the street itself dim. Something about that uneven lighting, one part illuminated, the other shadowed, felt fitting. It mirrored the way he looked, one part resigned, one part quietly holding on. "This timeline is softer," he said unexpectedly. "Softer?" I echoed. He nodded. "Less industrial, less harsh in the corners. In my world, the mills ran longer. The city held more noise, more people, more weight." He paused, searching for the right words. "Here, it's quieter, slower. I can't explain it, but the air feels younger." I didn't fully understand, but I nodded anyway. Sometimes understanding wasn't required. Presence was. We walked toward the main street where the sound of passing cars broke the silence. He stopped at the curb, watching the traffic flow like someone witnessing a ritual from another culture. His shoulders rose slightly with each passing engine, as if bracing for something he knew wouldn't come. "You said you needed 3 stable points," I recalled, "and you only found 1. He looked down at his hands. "Yes, 1 is not enough. 2 might have been. But 3, that's what binds a path through time. And without 3, I said quietly, "there's no doorway back." He didn't answer immediately. His eyes drifted to a distant window, its reflection catching a brief glint of winter sun. "No doorway," he confirmed. The finality of those 2 words sank deeper than any explanation he'd given before. It was no longer a matter of searching, of hoping, of what-ifs. It was the truth he had finally accepted. His timeline had moved on without him, and he now lived in its echo. We crossed the street and walked toward a small cafe at the corner. The scent of roasted coffee drifted toward us on the wind, warm, comforting, grounding. I pushed the door open for him. The bell above it chimed softly, a familiar sound that felt sharper in the context of everything he'd told me. Inside, the place was nearly empty. A few old chairs, mismatched tables, and a single radio in the corner playing a gentle melody. He sat near the window, resting his hands on the table as if anchoring himself to something tangible. "Will you be okay?" I asked. He looked at the street, at the world continuing without pause. Then he turned back to me with a quiet, tired smile. "I don't know," he said, "but I think I can learn to live in this version of time, even if it wasn't meant for me." There was a stillness in his voice, one that felt like a beginning disguised as an ending. "Do you want me to leave you alone?" I asked. His eyes softened. "No, not yet." So I stayed, because in that moment it didn't matter which timeline he belonged to. What mattered was that in this one, he didn't have to face the weight of it alone. I didn't see him again after that morning in the cafe. We talked for a long time, long enough for the coffee to cool between us, long enough for the quiet between our words to become something gentle rather than heavy. When we finally stood to leave, he thanked me once more, not with the desperation he carried earlier, but with a calm acceptance. A man settling into a life he never meant to live. He walked east, toward the old part of town, carrying nothing but the coat on his back and the small leather notebook tucked inside it. I watched him until he turned a corner and vanished from view, not in a supernatural way, not with any flicker of broken time, but simply in the human way all people disappear when they keep walking and you stop following. For a few days, I expected to see him again. I walked the same streets at the same hours, glanced at bus stops and cafe windows, half anticipating that deliberate way he scanned the world, searching not for danger but for familiarity. But the city moved on. Lowell kept rewriting itself in small ways, as all places do, and he slipped into its rhythm just as quietly as he had arrived. Sometimes I catch myself wondering about him, whether he found work, a room to sleep in, someone kind enough to give him directions without asking questions. Sometimes I imagine him standing on one of the bridges at dusk, comparing this world to the one he left behind, trying to find pieces of the life waiting for him in another timeline. But what stays with me most isn't the mystery of who he was or how he crossed from one world to another. It's the simple fact that for one brief morning, two strangers from two different versions of time walked beside each other and understood something the rest of the world never will. He didn't belong in this timeline, but for a little while, he didn't have to face it alone.